make some royal icing transfers. So what I've got here is I've got a transfer template. So this is actually available on my website. This is the coffee bean heart, and this is the size 1 inch and 1 1/4 inch. So these first 4 rows are the 1 inch, and then the bigger ones at the bottom are the 1 1/4 inch. So I printed this off just on a regular piece of paper, and I've put it inside of a paper protector. And so when you're making royal icing transfers, you want to use either like a cello bag or a paper protector like this, something that's going to allow you to trace the image but not on the paper, because you want the royal icing transfer to be able to come off of the surface. Now, you can use parchment paper. However, I have found that things tend to wrinkle. My icing will wrinkle if I use parchment paper, which is why I just stick with page protectors. They're also really easy to wipe off when you're done and reuse. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got my transfer sheet, I've got some brown flood icing, and I've got my brown outline icing, and I've got my scribe tool just in case I need any little scribing. What I'm going to show you is 2 different ways that you could go about making this transfer. The first way is I'm going to show you is to be outlining and distinguishing between every single section. So what I would do is I'm going to start just tracing with my outline icing the entire shape. So anywhere where there's a line, I will be putting icing. And it's okay if your lines are slightly off, because it's okay if everything is not perfect. You are a person, not a machine. Also, it's important that when you're making your outlines, you're keeping your piping bag not in contact with your paper, because if you make a line like that, it's going to be very broken and wiggly, whereas if you connect your icing and then you're pulling it while it's lifted off the paper, you're going to get a much nicer line. Okay, so in this first example, we are going to be flooding each section separately so that we can create some dimension in our transfer. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. Now, I always like to start with this very small section here in the corner, and I'm filling it in with my flood icing. And you'll notice sometimes you'll see people who, when they have a small section on a cookie, they'll add like a wiggle of thick icing before they flood it in. The beauty of a royal icing transfer is you don't actually need that. There's nothing underneath this to take the moisture out of the icing, so you're not going to run into cratering. And that's what's beautiful about royal icing transfers. So I have flooded in this small section, and now I'm going to flood in this section over here. Now, I'm flooding these in, and they're not touching, which is great. And that is going to create the dimension that I eventually you'll eventually see. So I'm not flooding in this section because it's touching this wet icing, and I'm not flooding in this section because it's touching this wet icing. So I'm flooding in 2 sections that are away from each other, that can dry, and that is going to give us some really, really lovely dimension. So we're going to give that a couple minutes to crust over before we continue filling it in. In the meantime, I'm going to flood this royal icing transfer, and I'm going to show you another great way that you can add dimension without all the drying time needed for this one. So on this second example, I'm just going to be outlining both beans. And I'm skipping over the middle line, and you'll see why as we get to that part. So I'm outlining just both of my beans. There we go. And now I'm actually just going to fill in this entire bean in the back. When I am flooding anything, I always like to start filling in the things that are in the background first, because it allows then when you fill in the other sections, it creates this effect that they're closer or they're in front. So All right, now that is flooded in, and we're going to give this just a few minutes to crust over. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and speed up a video of doing the rest in these rows. All right, so as you can see here, these are dry enough that I can very gently tap them. So they're crusted over. They're obviously not dry all the way through because royal icing takes a really long time to dry all the way through. But since my first section is crusted enough, I'm going to come in now and I'm going to fill in my second step. Now, just like I had mentioned before, I like to fill in what's in the background of whatever I'm making first. That way when I fill in what's in the foreground, it tends to be a little more defined and gives it that really nice dimension. So I filled that in. You can see that it's not blending together with the other section because this section is dry. I'm not going to fill in this section yet because this is still wet and I don't want them to merge together. Okay? And now that this first section is dry, and again, I am putting the smallest amount of pressure on this to find out if it's crusted over enough that I can fill in the next section. And it is crusted over enough, and so with this one, because we're doing a little bit less layers, I'm going to go ahead and flood in the second coffee bean. And again, as you can see, it's not melding together, and that's because my other layer is crusted over enough that these are going to stay two separate layers. Now the beauty of a royal icing transfer is even though the dimension is created here, when you lift it off of the paper, which is one of the end steps, it's going to be joined together into one piece. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest in another little bit of a fast mo for you. All right, now my second layer that I have added on here is crusted over, just like we were looking for previously, and so I have one more layer left that I'm going to fill in with my flood icing on this top transfer. So when you're filling in a royal icing transfer, you want to make sure that the icing is nice and right up against all of your lines. So you'll see that when I piped, I pushed the icing, and I'll show you again here. I'm pushing the icing into this line because I want it to flood over that line. What that's going to do is it's going to keep your transfer better bonded with each other, but it's also going to add just that little bit more dimension to your front coffee bean. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of this top layer of these last sections. All right, so we have all of our transfer layers up here flooded, and we have both of these transfers completely flooded. Now, since our bottom one, we're still wanting it to look like a coffee bean, not just two weird brown ovals. So what I'm going to do now that this is crusted over and this is crusted over, I'm going to come in with my thick outline icing, and I'm just going to add a line that's a little bit squiggly to give that coffee bean look. So this line doesn't have to be perfect. You just want it to be present. And when you're making it, you don't want to make your squiggles too wide. You want to keep them relatively contained with each other because the middle of a coffee bean is not super wide. Okay, so I'm going to go through, I'm going to add dimension to the rest of these beans. All right, so we now have all of our layers on our top one flooded, on our top example flooded. We have our lines added for adding that fun dimension for our second example. And now I'm going to let these dry. Now royal icing takes anywhere between 6 to 8 hours to dry for a full cookie. Because these are smaller, it is going to take less time. I like to air dry things. I don't actually have a dehydrator, and I don't like using a dehydrator. I know a lot of cookiers do, and so you definitely have the option of using a dehydrator for making royal icing transfers dry quicker. However, I usually just plan enough time for them to air dry. So I'm going to leave these to dry. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and leave them overnight to ensure that they're completely dried through, and then we will come back tomorrow and we will take them off and we will attach them to a cookie. All right, we are back. It has been overnight, and our royal icing transfers are now fully dry, which is lovely. So we are going to go ahead and scrape them off our paper. There's a couple different ways. You can just sort of pop them off with your finger. Otherwise, I have a little tool that I can use as well. This cutie little guy here, I have no idea where it came from. I just know I've had it for 4 years. So it's flat, very thin, so you can use it to just scrape your transfers. So something you'll notice is, do you see how perfectly clean this is? When you're getting transfers off of the sheet, if you start to scrape them and there's still a puddle of icing left in the middle, that means that your transfer is not fully dry. So if it's fully dry, it will come off super clean. I'm going to keep scraping these to see. They're pretty close to all the way dry, and for my purposes for today, it'll be fine. The only thing to note is when this is left behind, if it's bigger than this or more defined than this, is that your transfer is going to be much more likely to break or crush while you're attaching it to your cookie. So you do want to be careful, and you do want to make sure that your transfers are all the way dry. So I'm just going to finish scraping them off here. And then I'm going to go ahead and show you the back of a transfer is perfectly flat and dry. So this is what you want your transfers to be like when you are attaching them to your cookies. So let's go ahead and attach this beauty to a cookie. All right, so I have a little latte heart cookie in the theme of Valentine's Day going on here. And because our little heart coffee bean is very on trend, we're going to go ahead and we are going to attach it right in the middle of our mug. So in order to do that, you need your transfer. You'll need some thick icing. This is my outline consistency icing. I like to use the same color as the base of the cookie, just because that way if anything kind of splodges out, which you'll see, then it can be easily covered up or scraped off. Another thing, people like to use white. It doesn't really matter that much, but just to be safe, I'm going to use blue for today. So we have our transfer. I'm going to come to the back of it because this is the part we're going to be gluing down to the cookie. And I'm going to put a fair amount of icing back here. Okay, again, this is a thick consistency royal icing. I don't want to go all the way to the edges of my transfer because I am going to put a little bit of pressure on this when I push it down, and I don't want the icing to out the sides. Sorry about that noise. So here we go. We are going to make sure that our icing transfer is where we want it, and we're going to set it down. And then you can take your scribe tool or this lovely little tool I have, and you just want to lightly push to ensure that it is nice and glued. So you can see here that it is not very high raised off the cookie, so we want it to be pretty close because it will keep it secure. And note that it will take about an hour for this to fully dry on here. So if you are attaching transfers, give them some time to fully dry to attach them. Now another thing to note that's pretty important, my base cookie here, this icing is also fully dry, so this icing dried overnight last night. You want to be careful when you're attaching transfers to a base layer of icing. If this icing is not fully dry, it's very easy to break it when you're pushing the transfer to secure it. So be very careful if you're adding transfers. You want your base layer to be very well dried before you go ahead and stick those on. So my cookie is almost complete. I'm just going to add one final little line across the rim here, and that's just to give it a little bit of dimension. And there we go. We have our Valentine latte with our coffee bean heart royal icing transfer.